Well, good morning, Bentonville Church. It's great to be able to come together today to learn a little bit from God's Word. Today we're going to be in a couple of different places. We're going to be in Matthew 13, 44 through 46. That's where we're going to start, is Matthew 13, 44 through 46. And then we're also going to be in Luke 14 towards the end. So that Luke 14 passage will be 25 through 33. So I'd love for you to follow along as we get started. Many of us know the show American Pickers. It's on the History Channel. I'm not certain if it's even still going. But you have two guys who run this business in which they travel all throughout the United States, and they're looking for hidden gems, these pieces of Americana that they can kind of pull out of their hidden places, tell the people about the history, dust them off, and then sell them to collectors who are excited about the history behind those pieces. It might be old gas station signs or old toys, pieces of furniture that kind of filled a niche in American history. You've got coins and just all these different things. These guys are on the lookout for that hidden treasure. Now, we live here in the South, and if you're like me, you probably wound up going to things like swap meets and flea markets as a kid. I got dragged to those by my grandparents quite a bit. That's our version of American Pickers. Now, you're probably not going to find something worth a couple $1,000,000. In fact, maybe you did. I never did. Over the time, I would find little things that were important to me, historical trinkets, or something that I could clean up and use, so an old pocket knife or a tool. Those were the kind of treasures that I would find. That's what I enjoyed as a kid. The chances of me finding something I could turn around and sell for hundreds or thousands of dollars, that was kind of slim. But I'm amazed to watch these shows in which people just show up in the middle of nowhere. They pull back the vines, they go through the grass, they go to a building no one's opened in decades, and they discover a 57 Chevy. You just never know what's laying around in some of these hidden places. Well, Jesus today tells a couple of different stories, and the one we're going to start with is along the lines of American Pickers. If you go to Matthew 13, you get a number of different parables. This is the section in Matthew in which Jesus just stops to tell a bunch of parables. And it starts with one we looked at a few weeks ago. It starts with the parable of the sower, and then it goes into the parable of the weeds. It's an end times parable, talking about who is it what is the end of time going to look like? What's God going to do? We're going to hear about that one later on in a couple of weeks. Then you have the parable of the mustard seed and the yeast, these little things that create just a huge difference in the world around them. Then you have an explanation of the parable of weeds, kind of a return to this end of time, what's God going to do? And then you have the story that we're looking at today. And it starts like this: the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all that he had and bought the field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. Jesus stops to tell a story about two treasures, one that was unknown and one that was being sought. This treasure in a field reminds me a lot of my grandfather. My grandfather was a child of the Great Depression. And so throughout his life, it's not that he didn't trust banks, but he trusted where he could hide his money more. And so he would squirrel money away in different places, in a coffee can, under the mattress, in an envelope, in a sock drawer, kind of tucked into these random places. We're pretty sure that whenever he passed away and we sold his house, we probably missed a few. But we were finding money just constantly as we would look through his things and get that house ready to be sold. In the ancient world, there were no banks, or at least none that common people could use. There were no safe deposit boxes. There was no way of protecting these things that you valued. The only way that most people could keep things safe is to go dig a hole in a field and bury your treasure away, or stick it away in caves so that no one else will be able to find it. You know where it is, but they don't. The story goes that after 70 AD, when the city of Jerusalem fell, Roman soldiers just kind of laid aside their weapons and started digging random holes in fields because they were hoping to find the treasures that some of these, the Jewish settlers in the area, the Jewish citizens might have hidden away, trying to keep away from the Romans. And so they just ditched their weapons looking for treasures in fields. In our story today, Jesus tells a story that many in the audience would have been dreaming of. Someone had hidden this away. And we don't know why they never came back. Maybe they had died. Maybe they had forgotten about it. Maybe just along the way they had sold the field. It had passed down from generation to generation, and no one knew this treasure was there. Regardless of how it got there, what we have is the fact that it laid buried until it was found. You see, this day laborer, because that's who this person would be, this man who is out working, plowing the field probably for his boss, stumbles across it. His plow hits something, he hears that dull thud, he goes down with his hands and he digs to see what it is, and he discovers this treasure. And so he covers it all back up, he runs, he sells everything that he owns. And I can't imagine how that conversation goes with his wife or with his family. Look, I've got to get rid of everything, and I can't tell you why. But he sells everything that he has, gives up everything that made his life before that moment. And he bought that field. And how would this change that laborer's life? Well, everything would change. He would go from having something to having nothing to having everything he'd ever dreamed. Everything in his life would be different. Every aspect of who he is would change because of this treasure he'd found. There was a book that we don't read much, but it tells us a lot about Jewish life and history. It's found in the Apocrypha, but it's called The Wisdom of Sirach. And in a passage it says this: "Wealth and wages make life sweet." It's nice to have the money that we've earned or has been passed to us. Wealth and wages make life sweet. But better than either is finding a treasure. This idea of being out on a hunt and discovering something you never would have imagined, and just how different your world would be. The second part of Jesus' story tells a story about a pearl. Here we have a merchant, and this man knows what it is he's looking for. In fact, the Bible tells us that he is seeking a valuable object. And pearls in the ancient world were considered the most valuable object in existence. It would take a lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of danger to find just one pearl. And so in the ancient world, at the time of Jesus, pearls became a figure of speech for supreme wealth. It's why Jesus says, don't throw your pearls, don't cast them out before swine. And here we have this merchant who knows what he's looking for, and he's seeking the right pearl. He has other gems, other wealth, other pearls, but it's not the one. You see, he knows what he's looking for. He just hasn't found it yet. And I love that Jesus here uses the word seek, because other things should pop into our mind. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and ye will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. You have to know what it is you're looking for. Or as Jesus told in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. Seek first the kingdom and the righteousness. Not great wealth, not food to eat, not these things that we think might give us purpose or meaning or value. He says, seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Here we have a man who is seeking, and he finally finds what he's been looking for. And he takes all of these other things, and he gets rid of them. He sells them in order to attain what he's always hoped for, what he's always wanted, what he's always been seeking. In our story, we need to realize that these things cost everything. That treasure doesn't come cheap. It isn't free. That pearl is going to cost that merchant everything he'd accumulated to that point. You have to be willing to give it all. And what God is trying to tell us here, what Jesus is trying to say, is that the kingdom is worth it. The kingdom is worth leaving everything else behind in order to attain it. You see, grace Grace is a free gift from God. It's there. And it's free. But it might just cost you everything. You see, the kingdom is a treasure. And those who believe in it need to be willing to sacrifice everything for the kingdom's agenda. Jesus tells another story in another place. It's found in Luke chapter 14, and part of it's found in Matthew chapter 16 as well. But in Luke chapter 14, Jesus wants them to count the cost. He tells them, if you want to be my follower, you've got to know what that means. And so he says this, large crowds are traveling with Jesus. They turn to him and he says, if anyone comes after me, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father, mother, wife, and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And I want to stop here for just a second. We'll jump back into this. But the word hate here is meant to be really strong. It's a hyperbolic statement. He's not calling you to physically go and hate them, but to value them as less important than following Jesus. And that's hard for many of us to think about. Why is it that Jesus would say these words? And I'm going to come back to that in a second. Let's hear these words again. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, this person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider if he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming with 20,000? If he's not able, he will send a delegation while the other one is a long way off and ask for terms of peace. In this same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. The question sitting out there is, what are you willing to give up? What are you willing to let go? My dad was raised in a Catholic family. It was very important in their life and in their family. It was part of their history and their heritage. In the midst of his growing up, he watched Vatican II happen, where the Catholic Church radically changed. And as he began reading the Bible, he really struggled to reconcile some of the practices that he lived and had done both before and after Vatican II with what he was seeing in the text. And my dad really struggled and wrestled, and it led him to walking away from Catholicism and then walking away from faith for a while. But he was always seeking, he was always trying to find answers and truth. And so he studied a bunch of different religions and came back around to Christianity, but then went to all these different groups just trying to figure out what it means to follow Jesus. And he really struggled because his family, everyone in his family, was, and most of them still are, deeply Catholic. And he really struggled with, if I start following Jesus in this way, if I give my life to him in baptism, I might lose my family. I might lose my history and my heritage. I might lose these connections. And as he was sitting down and explaining this to a campus minister that he grew to know and love, the campus minister pointed to this passage. And he said, it's not that you are hating your family. It's that you are honoring Jesus more. Are you willing, if push comes to shove, to put Jesus ahead of your family, ahead of your heritage, ahead of your history? And my dad was baptized into Christ that day. Now, what might it cost you? It might cost you everything. Thankfully, his family was wonderful and supportive, and they didn't turn their backs, but it was always a struggle. But what might it cost us? Well, it could cost us everything. It might cost our family, our friends, our honor. It might even cost our lives. When Jesus used the word cross, everybody in the room would have gasped and kind of shunned away from it, because a cross was demeaning demoralizing. It was a hideous and grotesque way to die. And Jesus says, if you're not willing for that to happen, then how do you know if you can follow me or not? In the United States, it's relatively easy for us to be a Christian. I'll put it in quotation marks, and I'll explain why in a minute. Now, that might be beginning to change. It's no longer kind of culturally accepted or comfortable to always be a Christian. It used to be, it was just kind of what people did. Of course you went to church on Sundays. That was just part of life. That's beginning to change, but still there's no real persecution. No one is telling us we cannot meet, we cannot worship, we cannot have buildings, we cannot form schools. We still have the First Amendment that allows us the freedom to gather, to assemble, to worship. But it's becoming, throughout the world, that isn't the case. Persecution is on the rise, all over. You have people who are losing their freedom, their wealth, their families, their lives for their faith. Think of my friend Nick. Nick was a guy I met in South America, but Nick was from a Muslim country in the Middle East. And Nick, over time, he had grown up actually wanting to be a terrorist and a suicide bomber, and that's a long story. But he became acquainted with Jesus because he had heard from his imam, you can find Jesus in the New Testament. If you could just point it out to Christians, then we wouldn't have to have these fights. And so Nick got permission to sit and he read the entire Bible. And then he found you couldn't find Muhammad anywhere in the entire Bible. And so then he read it again, and he read it again, and he became fascinated with who Jesus was and what following Jesus might mean. And over time, Nick became a Christian. But for Nick, that meant leaving his country of origin. It meant moving across the world. It meant changing his name. It meant changing his history. It meant having to cut ties with much of his family. For Nick, these words ring true. What are you willing to give up for the sake of Jesus? Because what Jesus says is he doesn't want us to go in half-hearted. He doesn't want us to start and not finish what it is that we've started. If we start following Jesus and then go, I just don't think it's worth it, he's saying, well, people are going to ridicule that, and it's better if you had never started at all. So what might it cost us? Would you be willing to pay the cost? Now, as I said before, it's relatively easy for us to be a Christian here in the United States. But it might be a whole lot more difficult to truly be a follower of Christ. Because when Christ calls us, he calls us to leave everything and to follow him. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, on the first page of his book, The Cost of Discipleship, says, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Are you willing to leave everything behind to follow Jesus? Now, the cost for us might not be death. It might be a little less tangible. But it might mean that we have to put the kingdom ahead of everything else in our world, in our life, in our culture that says gives us meaning. So it might mean that we have to change our definition of wealth, that we stop trying to accumulate so much and more and more and more, and we learn to be content with what we have. It might mean that we put Jesus ahead of our security, which is hard for many of us to think about. It might mean that we have to put Jesus ahead of our politics, that we stop worrying so much about red and blue and we start thinking more about the kingdom of Christ. It might mean that we need to put Jesus ahead of our rights and our liberties. It might mean we need to let the kingdom have our time or our desires. It might mean we need to be willing to be ashamed for not looking like people around us, for being different, for having different priorities, different perspectives, different points of view. It might mean we have to give up our pursuit of status or importance. I don't know what that might be for you, but Jesus tells us, if you truly want to follow me, then all these things that we think might be important, all these other pearls and gems and things that the world tends to value, well, we have to realize they pale in comparison to the kingdom. I found this quote this week, and it says this: if the kingdom is present, then radical response is needed now. If the kingdom is worth all we have, then joy and celebration are going to accompany our finding and involvement with the kingdom. The problem is, he says, that most of us would like a little bit of the kingdom as an add-on to the rest of our lives. We'd like the pearl of great price without having to give up everything else. So we're called to instead refocus, reprioritize, to abandon what we thought was the purpose of life and focus instead entirely on what God is doing in the kingdom. Are we willing? Jesus puts it this way: whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. And this is the verse that always hits home. There was a professor at Harding, Neil Pryor, that this was his favorite verse, and it always just sticks in my mind. For what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? Are you willing to give up the things that don't matter as much to gain that which matters the most? Are you willing to lay aside even some things that are good for what is best? There was a missionary by the name of Jim Elliot who lost his life trying to take the gospel to a remote tribe in Ecuador. But in his journal, he had copied down a quote, and this became one of his lifelong quotes that he lived by. And I want us to end with this today. He is no fool. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. Let me say that again. He or she is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. If the kingdom is worth everything, then we should be willing to give whatever it takes to be a part of it. I want you to dig into this text this week. Whatever might have stuck in your head and your heart, just dwell with that this week. I'd love to hear what it is that you're thinking. But may God bless you as you continue to wrestle with our text from today. And may we always realize that it's never foolish to give up what we cannot keep to gain what we cannot lose. May we recognize the wealth of the kingdom of God and its inherent worth for our lives. May God bless you.